Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining the Whole Farm Sustainable Pest Management 12-lesson webinar course. With these courses, we are hoping to help you have a better understanding of ecological principles related to pest management, be able to pay closer attention to crop and soil health, have more patience with biocontrol methods, and better management strategies when working with biorational and other kinds of pesticides. I'm Joanne Baumgartner, the Executive Director of Wild Farm Alliance, and today we have is our second lesson. In today's lesson, we're talking about cost-effective habitat that offers a blanket of attack. And we're thrilled to have both speakers with us today. I wanted to just point out that this is there's 12 lessons. This is the second one. So the first one 2 weeks ago was recorded, and you can go to our website to view that. But there's a whole bunch more coming up all the way through March. And they're all on a Tuesday at 11 p.m. Pacific, except for the 2 in November, which are on Wednesday at the same time. I was just going to show them. So you could, next slide. Flip one more slide. Yes. And for today, as I mentioned, you can put questions in the chat while the speakers are presenting. And they're going to take questions right after the chat, but they'll also take questions toward the end. We will have a couple of polls that we're running in the middle of the session. They are going to be after each speaker, and they're Zoom polls. So you'll get to see if you are understanding the material, and then the presenters will go over that again. At the end of this webinar, we'd love to get your feedback. We also, because if you are requiring DPR credits or CCA credits, we'll need you to give us your license numbers. And specifically for DPR credits, you'll need to take a 10-question quiz at the end and get 70% right. Today's session, we have Dr. William Snyder, Professor of Agroecology and Systems Biology in the Department of Entomology at the University of Georgia, and Dr. Laura Mirandin, Associate Director at Pollinator Partnership. I want to say that I love their research because it is so in line with how we are trying to help growers both and PCAs and CCAs understand the world of pest management, and they've done some really incredible research and are going to share that today. So we're going to start with Bill.
Great. So I faced kind of the daunting task today of trying to talk about my 30 years of research in 15 minutes. So I'm going to try to just hit on a few of the major points about how natural enemy biodiversity might be important for biocontrol before Laura talks a little bit more about how to encourage greater natural enemy biodiversity. So here what I'm showing is sort of a typical agricultural monoculture, which is basically just row after row of one plant species. It's just bare earth in between those rows of plants. And the nearest slightly more natural habitat is that farm margin way off in the distance, or field margin way off in the distance. So this is a pretty simplified environment, of course, ecologically. And we know that pest outbreaks in a monoculture system like this can be really devastating. You can have pest insects completely wipe out a crop. Whereas in a more diversified system like I'm showing here, those types of outbreaks are less common. So if you go to something at the far extreme like a tropical rainforest, you almost never have all the plants stripped of all their vegetation like you often will in a monoculture if you don't intervene in some way. So from some of the earliest days of agroecology, people have thought that there's something about this greater biodiversity that's more typical of natural systems, that if we could restore this to farming systems, we might have fewer pest outbreaks. So one of the ways that might work is a more diversified system would probably have more resources for natural enemies. Of course, biological control is an important part of organic and other more natural types of farming systems. So with more resources, you can have pollen and nectar for natural enemies. You can have alternative prey. There might be other ways that a more diversified farming system might encourage greater biodiversity amongst natural enemies. But what I'm going to talk about for the first part of my talk now is why might we want a more diverse group of natural enemies, and how might that lead to stronger biological control. So first, I'm going to start off talking about just some of the ways that biodiversity is good for biocontrol before I start to talk about some of the complications. Okay, I think sometimes it's easiest to talk about my first point just looking at plant communities. So here again on the top row, I've got a typical monoculture system where you have all individuals of the same plant species, versus on the bottom row is a diversified system with many different species, like more like a prairie type community. And of course, in the top row here, you can see that all the plants are sort of competing for the same subset of resources. They're all trying to do ecologically things in the same way. They're growing to the same height. They're probably flowering at the same time. So basically, they're all occupying the same ecological niche and sort of tightly competing for the limited subset of resources that fall within that niche. Versus here in the diversified system, you have lots of different species doing things in different ways. So, for example, species with long versus short roots are probably accessing different parts of the nutrients that are in the soil, different aspects of moisture that's in the soil, and so on. So when you have different groups of species that occupy different niches, they complement one another to do more stuff overall. So how might this work for a biocontrol community? So I want to talk about a couple examples from our and other people's work that show how a diverse group of natural enemies might lead to a better blanket of attack across a whole group of pest species, or even within the single species. So here's an example from a PhD student in my lab, Corey Straub, a few years ago, where he found it was important that the different natural enemy species foraged in different places. So they have spatially different niches. In this community, he was working on collard plants, and he found that predators differed in where they foraged on the collard leaves. So first of all, important natural enemies in the system were lady beetles. They're very voracious predators of these aphids that were occurring on these collard plants, but the lady beetles foraged only on the edge of the leaf. That's because the leaves are so slippery because of their waxy coating that the lady beetles could only hold on to forage at the edge of the leaf. So if you had only lady beetles in this system, you would have all the aphids wiped out at the edge of the leaf, but they still would have a refuge where they were safe from attack in the middle of the leaf. That's why it was important that there was a second group of natural enemies, some predatory bugs and some parasitoid wasps that were a little more nimble, a little lighter, and they could get at the aphids and attack them in the middle of the leaf. So to have a full attack of aphids everywhere they occurred on the plants, you had to have both the voracious lady beetles at the edges of the leaves, and then the smaller predatory bugs and parasitoids that could attack the aphids at the center of the leaf. So basically removing any spatial refuge for the pests. You needed to have multiple species of natural enemy. So this again is a form of complementarity. So the predator species are complementing one another in their niches where they're attacking in space. Okay, just a second example real quick where there was a difference in the natural enemy species that was important in both space and time. The pest here was the Colorado potato beetle. This was some work that was done by Ricardo Ramirez, who was another PhD student in my lab a few years ago. Colorado potato beetle is typical of a lot of insects where it has a complex life cycle, where you start off with the eggs being deposited in the foliage, then almost all the damage is done by successively larger larval stages where they're feeding on the foliage of the plant. Then they're done in the foliage for this stage. They drop down into the soil where they pupate beneath the ground before emerging again as adults. So these potato beetles spend about half their life in the foliage of the plant where they're doing all the damage, but then another half of their life down in the soil where they're pupating. And Ricardo found that to have good control of potato beetles, you need a diverse community of natural enemies, because only when you had these diverse natural enemies would you cover attacks across all of the complex life cycle. So different natural enemies included things like lady beetles that would feed on the eggs of the potato beetles, predatory bugs that would feed on the larger larvae, large ground beetles that would feed on the larger larvae all above ground. Then when the beetles dropped below ground, you had a diverse community of entomopathogens, things like entomopathogenic nematodes, entomopathogenic fungi that would attack the beetles in the soil. So here again, to have no safe refuge for the potato beetles across their life cycle, you needed a diversity of natural enemies that attack them both in their smaller stages as eggs and then larvae, and then also attack them when they drop below ground. So again, removing any refuge through space and time for the potato beetles, you needed to have natural enemies filling all these different and diverse niches. So one more example that's a little bit different. This is not complementary. This is what we would call facilitation. This is an example from a paper by Losi and Deno. They were looking at control of pea aphids in alfalfa fields. And they found here, again, you needed to have two different groups of natural enemies to have effective control. So the first of these were, again, lady beetles foraging in the plant foliage. But here the aphids had a defensive strategy. So when they were being attacked by lady beetles, they could escape from them by dropping out of the foliage onto the ground. Crawl to another plant, they safely escape normally. But that's not the case if you also have ground beetles in the system. So if there's ground beetles present too, then whenever the aphids try to escape from the lady beetles by dropping from the foliage, they're snatched up on the ground by these ground foraging ground beetles. This is a case where they do have these two spatially different niches in the foliage versus on the ground. This is really what we call here facilitation, because it's really the lady beetles have to be present for the ground beetles even to encounter these aphids. So they're actually facilitating capture of prey by a different natural enemy. So much more effective biocontrol, again, when you have two species present versus just one. Okay, to continue our sort of biodiversity 101, most people, when they think of biodiversity, what they're really thinking about is what ecologists would call species richness, or the number of species. So here with these blue circles, I'm showing some resource. So say this is all the total different array of pests that are available. As you add 1 versus 2 versus 3 versus 4 different species of natural enemy, you're covering more of that niche. So basically more pests are being eaten. But what people don't think about oftentimes is there's a second aspect of biodiversity that's important too. This is what's called evenness, and that is how equally or disequally abundant are the different types of natural enemies. So here's a case where the natural enemies are really unequally abundant. This blue species is very common. The other species are less common. And here as we go to increasingly higher evenness to the case where all the different natural enemies are abundant and equally abundant. So it's something like the balance of nature is sort of an equivalent. And I want to talk just for a second about how both of these aspects of biodiversity can be important. Okay, here I'm showing a simple system where we have 3 pests, an aphid, a flea beetle, and a caterpillar. And here we're going from lower species richness up to higher richness and evenness. Okay, so the case where we have low enemy richness, only the ground beetle is present, only the caterpillar is being attacked. So in this case, the 2 other pests are not being attacked at all. So we want to add more species to the system. We add a parasitoid that attacks the aphid, a spider that attacks the flea beetle. So now we have full richness. All of the different pests are being attacked, but because the parasitoid and the spider are not very abundant, there's not much attack on the aphid and the flea beetle. And that full blanket of attack is really only achieved when we have high species richness. So all 3 natural enemy species are there, and all 3 are abundant, which we see here on the far right, where all of the pests have a natural enemy attacking them, and all of them are being attacked at a relatively high rate. So both richness and evenness can be important aspects of biodiversity to have good pest control. Okay, so to just summarize this first part, predators that hunt at different places, different times, or hunt in different ways can complement one another. So they have this blanket of attack that's attacking the pests everywhere they are in space and time. So this makes it seem like it's really simple. Biodiversity is always good, right? But of course, we know in ecology that things are never quite that simple. There always is some complication. And particularly with predators, with some of the generalist predators that feed on many different prey, the complication is that they're just hungry. They don't really care about attacking pests versus other types of species, and they often will attack one another. So here's an example of cannibalism. So this is a larger lady beetle larva that's attacking its smaller brother or sister. Also, natural enemies will attack different species. Here's a praying mantis that's attacking a hummingbird, just sort of a predator / pollinator. So in both cases, when you have natural enemies at higher graded biodiversity, you might present more opportunities for the natural enemies to attack one another. This would be a negative form of biodiversity. So biodiversity is not uniformly good if the natural enemies are just spending all their time attacking one another. So this would not necessarily be good for biocontrol. You want them to attack pests and not kill each other. And really, when we're thinking about predator biodiversity effects, it's always going to be a balance between these 2 types of effects. So that's complementarity that I already talked about, where they're differing and where they're attacking pests in space and time. versus this risk of interference. They bump into each other a lot and they just kill one another and actually weaken biocontrol. So there's been a little bit of thinking about how we might manipulate farming systems to make it more likely that we have this positive complementarity versus this negative interference. And I'm showing that here with sort of two simple schematics. Let's talk about the one on the left first. This is our monoculture again. So here we have, say, just our collard or broccoli plants. So we're going to have a limited diversity of pests. We also have a limited range of foraging environments. So all of our natural enemies are occurring on this one type of plant, and they're all trying to attack just a limited range of pests. So this could be good that they're ganging up on the pests, but they also might feed on one another. So there's a lot of opportunities for the natural enemies like these lady beetles to bump into parasitoids and attack and kill them, the ground beetle to attack the parasitoids, and so on. So with a simplified environment, there's a lot of opportunities for predators to kill one another instead of killing the pest. As opposed to here on the far right, where we have a diversified cropping system, where we say have broccoli and a legume planted together. We have something like a reduced tillage system where we also have decaying plant matter on the soil surface. Maybe we have some flowering plants planted nearby. So now we have a very diversified farming system where there's lots of different prey that are available to the natural enemies, which can be beneficial to them. But this also provides fewer opportunities for the natural enemies to bump into each other. So basically, they have an opportunity here to occupy the different niches that they want to occupy, to have that niche separation that leads to them bumping into each other less often and killing each other less often. So with a diversified farming system, you have more resources for your natural enemies, and you also have fewer opportunities for the natural enemies to bump into each other and kill one another. So it's kind of a two benefits at once. Okay, so some practical strategies to rebalance in favor of complementarity. I've already mentioned a couple of these, but just to touch on them once again. Okay, anything that adds structural complexity to a field is going to tend to tip the balance in favor of predator conservation and complementarity and away from interference. So things like reduced tillage or adding a straw mulch to the ground is going to provide a couple benefits to our natural enemy communities. With that greater structural complexity, the natural enemies aren't bumping into each other as often, and also decaying plant matter on the soil surface can encourage things like springtails that are alternative prey for your natural enemies and provide them with more food. So basically more places for your natural enemies to hide from one another, and more prey that can be available to them. Also, things like adding flower strips or polycultures to your system are going to provide pollen and nectar that are alternative prey for your natural enemies. Again, more food for them and less opportunity for them to attack, find, and kill one another. And there are some farming systems that we've worked with that provide a lot of opportunities to diversify a farm. So organic farming often uses manures instead of chemical fertilizers. So manures feed soil food webs in a way that chemical fertilizers don't, providing, again, detritus-feeding prey like springtails that feed natural enemies and help them to avoid killing one another. Other types of polycultures, diversified systems that have vegetables and fruit together will have many different things for flowering at the same time, being harvested at the same time, providing refuges to natural enemies. And a system we've been interested in too is livestock, vegetable, fruit. Really highly diversified farming systems can have an incredible array of different habitats, lots of different foods for your natural enemies, can be a really friendly environment to take them through the season. So just to wrap up, I think I'm pretty close to right on time. So really quick overview of predator biodiversity. So again, biodiversity has two components: richness, which is the number of species there, and evenness is how evenly they are distributed. So you really want to have both of these. You want to have a lot of species there, and you want to have a lot of species that are similarly abundant. So you have lots of niches that are being filled when you have more species there, and then more completely filled when you have relatively even abundances amongst your natural enemies. So predator species can complement one another by filling different niches in space and time, or in how they hunt for prey. But when they're forced to fill the same niche, they can interfere with and kill one another. So anything that increases field or farm complexity enhances your chances for greater complementarity amongst natural enemies and reduces the chances for them to interfere with one another. And diversified farming systems of all different sorts of types can be a great way to provide that greater structural and prey diversity that leads to more complementarity amongst natural enemies and less interference amongst them, thus improving biological control. All right, just again to take a second to thank the people who did the work. Corey and Ricardo did some of the research I talked about, specifically highlighted. USDA has paid for all of our research. And here's some contact information for me. And I don't know, do I maybe have time for questions now or will in a minute? So thanks everyone for your attention.
Yeah, Bill, we have some time for questions. Let's see. Sorry. Shoot. Here we are. Do we not have questions?
I don't see any yet. We could run our poll.
Okay, let's run the poll. So now, everybody, please answer these questions and make sure if you want DPR credits that you answer them. And then Bill could talk about the right answer. All right, we got most of the people have answered the questions now. Bill, can you see the answers?
I can.
Yeah, do you want to go over them?
Sure. So again, here we're talking about evenness. Remember, the two aspects of biodiversity are species richness, which is the number of species that are there. And so when you have higher richness, you have more niches that are being occupied. But greater evenness is when you have more species actually filling each niche. So in this case, evenness is improving biocontrol, not by so much, removing any refuge from attack, but making sure that any pest is facing a lot of attacks anywhere that it's occurring in the environment. So the evenness is having that sort of a balance of nature type of effect where, you need to have more species, but you also need to have greater evenness so that each one of those niches is really fully filled and each niche is being completely exploited by different predators that are out there. So the correct answer to this one should be number one. Different predator species are filling their unique feeding niches more completely. Yeah, so again, facilitation, so it's sort of a fine line there, but the complementarity is just when the natural enemies are in a different niche. But facilitation is sort of a more active process, like in the example where actually in this case, the ground beetles aren't getting any prey at all unless the lady beetle is there. So lady beetle is up in the foliage, it's scaring the aphids and make them jump in the ground. Otherwise, if that doesn't happen, the ground beetles are just running around kind of starving, not encountering any prey at all. So it's really more of an active interaction between the two natural enemies. Some people call it kind of the rock in a hard place problem. So the aphids can escape from the lady beetles by jumping on the ground. They can escape from the ground beetles by staying up in the foliage. But when both of those two things are present together, they facilitate each other's feeding.
Yeah, that's such a cool, well, your whole presentation is really cool. Thank you, Bill. So with that, now we are going to switch gears and have Laura present, and we'll come back later after Laura's presentation to see if there are questions for Bill.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. That was great. Okay, well, hi everyone, and thanks for being here today, and thanks to Wild Farm Alliance for doing this webinar series. So I'll start by introducing Pollinator Partnership, just very briefly. We're the largest organization in the world that's dedicated exclusively to the protection of pollinators and their habitats. And we meet this mission through education and outreach, advising policy, research, convening stakeholders, and habitat creation. We have many programs and lots of free resources on our website that you can check out, including our eco-regional guides, our annual poster, our pollinator steward certification program, and our bee-friendly farming certification program. Okay, Now, at this point, you might be asking yourself, why is a person from a pollinator organization talking about pest control and habitat in agricultural systems? Well, I bet you likely suspect the answer already, but it's that it's all connected. So I started out as a baby scientist about almost 30 years back, working on enhancing pollinators and pollination in agriculture in order to maximize production and sustainability and biodiversity. And along the way, I became more and more interested in the pest pressure and pest control aspect of agriculture and conservation. One reason might be because that's what a lot of the farmers were interested in. And so the idea of marrying the concepts of pollinators and other beneficial insect support in working lands became more appealing. And so I began doing research that examined habitat in agriculture in relation to pollinators and pests and biocontrol beneficial insects, and how all of these insects are impacted by the farm landscape and farming practices. And I also wanted to know how all this relates to the economics of farming. So now, as an older or more mature scientist and someone that guides our programs and research, I see these topics of pollinators and pest control really is always intertwined, and we intertwine them in a lot of our programs. And this connection is seen in one of our pollinator partnership flagship programs, the Bee Friendly Farming Certification, which is a program that supports and acknowledges growers for the good work that they're doing for pollinators and other beneficial insects. And it helps with their efforts to reduce chemical pesticide usage. So the two main pillars of this program are having habitat to help reduce that usage, the chemical pesticide usage, and also to put in habitat to support beneficial insects. Focusing on the habitat side of things and some research that I conducted with colleagues in the Central Valley of California. And the primary question that I'll explore today is, how does habitat on farm impact pest insects, control or biocontrol beneficial insects, pest pressure in the crop, and crop pollination? And then how do these benefits relate to the economics of creating habitat? So when we talk about habitat in agricultural landscapes, another term for this is landscape diversification, which Bill talked about too. And there's a lot of research that shows that diversification of agricultural landscapes can benefit biodiversity. And in some cases, the research does show that there's a benefit to production as well. But diversification can mean a number of different things at different scales. So at a landscape level, this could mean a region or a county that has a diversity of land types. So there could be a patchwork of different types of land use. For example, there could be a combination of different crops. There could be riparian areas. There could be grazing land. There could be conservation areas. Then level, diversification might look like having cover crops, times, or different crops on different fields, intercropping, set aside fields, things like that. And then at the smaller scale, what I call the subfield level, diversification can be more things like addition of a hedgerow or a floral strip or small non-cropped areas like pivot corners. So for the rest of the talk, I'll be sticking with that subfield diversification, where habitat is added as hedgerows to otherwise unused scrubby field edges. And my two primary collaborators on this work were Rachel Long from UC Cooperative Extension. She's now retired, but still quite active. And Dr. Claire Kremen, who was at UC Berkeley, but she's now at the University of British Columbia in Canada. And the hedgerows that we examined, they were made up mainly of native shrubs, and also some of them had some herbaceous native flowers and grasses. And they were installed for the primary purpose of supporting beneficial biocontrol insects. So things like those lady beetles, hoverflies, spiders, parasitoid wasps, lacewings. We did a host of sampling and experiments in these native plant hedgerows, which for the most part were about 15 years old at the time that we did these experiments. And we compared the beneficial and pest insect communities in the hedgerows to the alternative, which for most fields were these kind of weedy, scrubby edges. And you can see that in the bottom right photo there. These types of kind of weedy, scrubby edges, they're sort of the common edge in the area. They're pretty much unused, they're unmanaged. Some of them get mowed a few times a year. And in addition to studying the pest and beneficial insects in the native plant hedgerows and scrubby edges, we also did monitoring and collections and experiments into the fields. So we used hedgerows and the weedy, scrubby edges that were all beside tomato fields so that we had a consistent crop background so that we could compare how these two different types of edges impacted pollination and pest control into fields. Okay, so we're going to get into some results here. And in these next few graphs, the native plant hedgerow results are the black bars, and what we found in the control weedy scrubby edges are the white bars. So looking first at the graph on the left, these are the beneficial predatory insects. And again, being a predator means that you eat other insects, pretty intuitive. You're probably familiar with lots of these. Bill mentioned them, and I've mentioned them: lacewings and lady beetles, spiders, syrphid flies. And what we found with these predatory insects that help control pest insects is that they were present in about equal numbers in the native plant hedgerows and in those weedy, scrubby edges. And I'll talk about what that might mean for pest control in a minute. When we look at the parasitoid wasps, which is the right-hand graph, you can see that the total number of these beneficial parasitoid wasps, they're often tiny wasps, and they lay their eggs in the pest eggs or larvae or adults, and they end up killing them that way. So that's why they're not called predators, they're called parasitoids. But these parasitoids, they were present in about twice the number in hedgerows than in weedy edges of fields. And these parasitoids are great natural control of a lot of the common pests in the Central Valley, things like stink bug, aphids, and lygus bug. Okay, and going back to those predatory, actually I won't go to that yet. Let's look at the pest insects first. So in these two different types of edges, we can see that for almost all pests, they were in much higher numbers in the weedy edges than in the native plant hedgerows. So this was really striking. Overall, these pests were about 10 times more abundant in the weedy edges than in planted hedgerows. Okay, so going back to those predatory insects that were in about equal abundance in weedy edges and hedgerows, this means that even though they weren't greater in hedgerows, there was a better ratio between predatory insects and pest insects in hedgerows than in weedy edges. So the predators that were in the hedgerows likely could better control the pest populations since they weren't so outnumbered. They probably were also eating each other too, so there could have been help with them sustaining each other through that. The parasitoids, if you remember, they were actually in greater numbers in the hedgerows, so those too would have been better able to control the low number of pests in the native plant hedgerows than in weedy edges where they were less abundant. Okay, now how did this impact things going into fields? Well, what we did was we assessed many different pests and beneficials. We did leaf turns, we did all kinds of observations, we did sticky cards, and we looked at beneficials and pests up to 200 meters into the fields from the edges. And what we found was that most of the insects we were seeing in the edges, so it kind of mirrored, not too surprising, what was happening in the edges going into the fields. And that seemed to extend for most things up to about 200 meters into the fields. Whether that was these pest insects or the beneficial insects. So as an example of one thing that we found, this graph shows the overall number of beneficial insects that we found on the tomato plants. So that's the dark triangles now with that solid line. And we compared it to the open white triangles, which were the weedy field edges, and then the distances into the field. And right up to 200 meters, there was more beneficial insects in the fields that had hedgerows. Now, looking at the lines above with the circles, now we're looking at aphids. The aphids were more abundant up to 200 meters into fields with weedy edges. That's the open circles with the dashed line. And compared to the number of aphids on the crop where there was a hedgerow beside the field, we see lower aphids up to 200 meters from that field edge. We also tested how well stink bugs could be controlled at different distances into fields. And for this experiment, we couldn't put out live stink bug egg masses. The growers probably wouldn't like that, but what we did was we bred stink bugs in the lab, which was quite fun, actually. They make good, easy pets if you're looking for a pet. And we harvested their egg masses, and then we froze the egg masses so they wouldn't actually hatch in the field. But they would still be there for the parasitoid wasps to parasitize and then control if they had been actually active live egg masses. So we put them at different distances into the field, and this is called sentinel monitoring. They were sentinel egg masses, and it allowed us to test pest control from beneficial parasitoid wasps. And you can see from the graph where the closed circles are the hedgerow and the open is the control sites, that there was a greater number of parasitoid wasp control from hedgerow sites than weedy field edges. And this translated significantly at 100 meters. We could see that difference. At about 200 meters, the difference wasn't quite so great, but there might have been some greater control there in the fields that had the hedgerows. We also wanted to determine which fields reached economic threshold for pest treatment based on UC IPM guidelines. So we assessed fields for pest levels. We went out every week or two, and we also got pesticide application records for all of the fields that we worked in. The 2 years that I'm showing you here, the only major pests in the tomato fields were aphids. So I'll show you the results for that. And what we found was that in 4 of the 8 fields that had a weedy edge, they required pesticide application for aphids, whereas only 1 of the hedgerow fields reached economic treatment level for aphids. So kind of as an aside to this, that one hedgerow, it's hard to find enough sites sometimes when you're doing field research. That hedgerow had a lot of mustard in the understory of it, and there was a lot of aphids on that mustard. So I suspect that's why that this one hedgerow field required treatment. Okay, so let's get a little into the economics here of what we looked at. We used some of this data and some other information over the course of a few years, and we came up with costs and benefits of installing a native plant hedgerow in the Central Valley.
How you translate.
And the model included the total cost for 3 years to install a hedgerow using information paper by Rachel Long and Anderson. And then we put in the benefits of greater pest control and lower cost of pesticide application due to the hedgerow. And another part that I'm not talking about so much here is we also added in the benefits of pollination enhancement from a hedgerow. And we did this modeling having a crop that either required or benefited from pollination. So that's wild pollinators spreading the pollen once every 3 years, which is a pretty realistic crop rotation in that region. So it'd be like once every 3 years having something like cucumbers, peas, or melons. And we put this together into an economic model that could be adapted for different types of crops or pest issues. And what we found was that the cost of putting in a native plant hedgerow was offset by the better crop production due to pollination and the lower need for chemical pesticides, so saving the grower money. And with these benefits together, that's the green line, that's when we're modeling both of those benefits, a native plant hedgerow pays for itself in about 7 years. And then it continues to provide economic benefits long after. So, like I said, these hedgerows that we were in, they were about 15 years old at the time, and they were just doing great. And they took little or no maintenance after the first 3 years. So, again, just if you're looking at that graph, that's where the green line crosses the other green line, where those two green lines intersect. That's where you get your return on your investment from putting in a hedgerow. Keep in mind, this is a little dated now, might cost a little bit more to put in a hedgerow. So this isn't necessarily exact for every situation, but it gives you an idea.
Yeah.
Okay, so this has been a big focus on my study and that I did with collaborators. But I want to point out that these are by far not the only studies that show that hedgerows and non-crop habitat benefit pollination and pest control. So these are just a scattering of papers that I've been involved in. There's lots of other papers. And these are called meta-analyses because what they do is they take a whole bunch of studies, they crunch the numbers, and then they see what comes out from that. So if you find a signal, so better with some kind of factor like more diversification, more predators or parasitoids or better pest control from a whole bunch of studies put together, it's pretty strong evidence that you're really seeing something true that's happening on the ground. So I'm not going to get into all these studies, but just one example here of a paper that analyzed many studies. And they wanted to see if more diverse or complex landscapes resulted in more or less beneficial insects. So on the left side, you can see what factor they were analyzing, and we'll just look at that top one, the enemies. And then there's those horizontal line, vertical dotted line. So if that horizontal line is to the right of the vertical dotted line, it means they saw a significant increase in that factor with farm diversification, essentially more habitat. So you can see that natural enemies overall, and pollinators too, those two top rows, convincingly the abundance is greater, and also they did look at richness, that was greater too, is greater when there's more habitat in the landscape. Okay, so I'm just going to end off here. I want to acknowledge that there's a lot of barriers for farmers for adding habitat to their operations. So I can't talk about all of those right now. We know that barriers include things like time, competing priorities, space on the farm, technical support. So this limits what many growers are able to do. We have a lot of programs that address these barriers. We have funds to help put in habitat. We have technical resources and things. So does Wild Farm Alliance. And I encourage you to check our website and contact us if you're looking for help. But that hasn't received much attention that concerns many growers is that putting in habitat might increase pests and pest damage in crops. So to address that, we do have a large multi-state grant that we're working on, some research we're doing where we're looking at alternate pest host plants. So these are the plants outside of the crop that might be hosting the pests. And we're creating databases and tools so that growers and land managers that want to put in habitat or manage habitat can easily find out which plants they might want to avoid and which plants are safe to use. We call this our Pest tool. There's a few different Pest tools that we have, and Pest stands for Pollinator Enhancement Security Tool. And the tagline for it is it helps you weed out the plants that might support pests in your system. So contact us if you're interested in that, or check out those on our websites. Okay, and I will end off my presentation there. I think just about on time.
Is it because?
Thank you, Laura. Now we are going to run the 2-question poll and give people a minute or two to answer it, and then you could go over the 2 questions. So here's the poll. Okay, how about Laura, if you talk about these two questions and the answers, the right answers.
Yeah, sure. So most people got that first one, that to break even on the cost of a hedgerow takes about 7 years. Again, caveats to that, of course. But when you include pollination and pest control for just this one pest, we get that return on investment of 7 years. Now, if there were other pests that the hedgerows could facilitate controlling, that maybe are even more expensive to control with pesticides, that window might even be shorter. Or if we added in other benefits from the hedgerow, so perhaps things that are a little bit less easy to quantify, like water filtration or a windbreak. So there are other benefits too. So the 7 years, I feel, is quite a conservative estimate.
Yeah, we rented it.
Okay, and then going to the next one, which group had greater abundance in hedgerows than in the scrubby edges? And most people got that. It was the parasitoids. So remember, those are the usually wasp-like things that lay their eggs in the pests. So they don't directly eat them like predators do. And the reason that we suspect that these were higher in the hedgerows compared to the weedy edges was because of those floral resources. Because of those floral resources that we know help sustain parasitoids. So they'll go to flowers and drink nectar. And there are studies that show they have a longer longevity and greater reproductive output when they have floral resources to help support them.
Great, thanks, Laura. Well, it looks like we have some questions for you. You answered one in the chat. There's a couple more, and then we have 4 questions for Bill. So here's one. What hedgerow crops or cover would enhance predators of persea mites in avocado orchards? That might be a
we'll
too
do that right
specific
now.
question.
Yeah, that's pretty specific. I would need to look into it, and so which plants specifically support those predators. Yeah, I wouldn't know that offhand. So I didn't mention, however, that in these hedgerows we had things like toyon and coffeeberry, elderberry. There was some salvia, Odie brush, things like that were the plants in these hedgerows. Bill, I don't know, maybe you have an answer to that specific question.
I don't. I'm the same as you. I'd have to look it up as well.
Yeah. Let's see. Laura, is there a link to the Pest tool online? We can
draw. Okay, so yeah, so we do. So what right now, what we have, we're sort of rapidly developing these and getting them out. We have one for Canada. So I'm actually sitting in Canada right now, and I originally was with the Canadian side of the organization. So I developed one for Canadian crops, quite applicable to US as well. So Joanne, are you sending out resources after? Can we put in links to these?
Yes.
Okay,
we'll do
yes.
that.
And we're developing one specifically for blueberry right now, and we're hoping to do one for strawberry and other crops as well.
Great. Bill, how about a couple questions that have come in for you? The first one, how do you introduce natural enemies?
Well, I think the main thing is sort of what Laura was talking about is, to have habitat that's there for the natural enemies, that's going to draw them in naturally. I think that's usually more effective than doing things like buying lady beetles or praying mantis egg cases or anything like that and trying to directly introduce them. So kind of let nature do the job for you is generally the right way to go. Of course, probably the best way to conserve natural enemies is to avoid using broad-acting insecticides. It's going to be, of course, the most effective way to conserve natural enemies.
Good point. Here's another one, Bill. Does the increased structural complexity also offer the pests better hiding spots?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So any of these predator conservation strategies, again, it's something like Laura was touching on. You would worry with some hedgerow habitats, or you're also attracting pests. There's always going to be some complications that are out there. So there's really no simple answer with this sort of building up this broad pharmacology. But what you're kind of hoping for is for the positive effects to outnumber the negative effects. We know that big, simple monocultures have explosive pest outbreaks all the time. So as much as we can do to add greater biodiversity should help to sort of stabilize the system.
Mm-hmm. Stabilizing the system with where it's at. So kind of similar to that, another person says the principles make sense, but implementation feels trickier. Have you done research on how to obtain high richness and evenness?
Yeah, we sure have. So a couple different things. So first of all, farming system is really, really important. So for example, we did a big study one time looking at how organic farming across a broad diversity of crops, a meta-analysis like Laura had mentioned was part of this study, enhances evenness among natural enemies. And that greater evenness seemed to translate, at least the one study crop we worked in, which was potatoes, into stronger biocontrol. So why organic farming is encouraging greater evenness? It's probably some combination of fewer harmful insecticides that knock down particular natural enemies, and then more alternative prey from the use of manures and things like that. So it's just one example of how you can obtain greater biodiversity among natural enemies. Some of the different types of diversified farming systems I mentioned, like integrated animal crop agriculture, bring a lot of diversity to the farm that encourages greater biodiversity amongst natural enemies.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So this is another one question that's questioning the premise or just worried a bit. And they say how there's these beneficials that attack the pests, predatory mites, sick spotted thrips, and Staphylococcus lady beetles all eat mites. But the thrips also attack the predatory mites, and the Staphylococcus also eats other predators. So is this an example of richness that brings interference? And I think people are just trying to get their heads around this. Like, how does this work?
I think I've spent 30 years now trying to get my head around how this works exactly. Yeah, so that's what always is going to happen. Whenever you have more biodiversity, you have more complexity, you're going to have more complex feeding relationships. But it still does seem that just by having that greater complexity of sort of more redundancy, more complexity of interactions, it's just harder for any single pest species to reach those really explosive abundances. So, you always have natural enemies feeding on one another to some extent, but you also have lots and lots of things in a species-rich system attacking any one pest species. So it's good. I had a slide about that I was going to have as my last slide. I took out at the last second, but that really touched on that. Just all the complexity that happens amongst in feeding relationships in a really diversified system.
Mm-hmm. And then that kind of ties in, Laura, with your study with how the hedgerows, which had all the diversity of plants, really were supporting a diversity of beneficials versus those weeds, which were the weeds as diverse as the hedgerow plants, or what was the weeds were the kinds of plants that pest insects like?
Yeah, the weedy edges were pretty diverse with weeds. There's a lot of weeds that'll colonize those areas. So, things you can think of, mallows and dandelion and related type things. And in terms of sort of this complexity and building up this complexity, I think that's why it's pretty important to see then what is happening in the field, like where the rubber meets the road sort of thing, because these systems, like Bill was saying, it gets so complex as you up the diversity, you get different feeding interactions that are more complex, but then what happens in the field? And so in some studies that we have found that where the rubber meets the road, and lots of other researchers too, you're getting that better pest control in the field overall when you have this diversity.
Mm-hmm. Well, fantastic. Thank you both for your presentations and explaining how this works more. So now we're gonna go to our evaluation and quiz. Thank you all for attending. Please, everybody, fill out the questionnaire and tell us what you thought about this webinar and how we can make improvements on it. And if you need CCA or DPR credits, we need your license numbers, and DPR specifically, you need to take the 10-question quiz. So thank you so much, everybody. Fantastic.